He evinced the devotedness on another occasion, which occurred before the emperor's departure for the army, always seeking to prove that, but for him, the tranquility of the empire could not exist, and that our security depended entirely on his zeal for the service of the emperor. The successive demands for troops, which had been repeated within so short a time, had produced a bad effect in different parts of the country. There was no insurrection in the western departments, but the system of pillage again commenced. That is to say, a band of about 50 robbers infested the country, firing on the gendarmerie and plundering everybody from whom they could obtain anything. These wretches, wishing to excite in their favor a portion of the population from whom they might obtain protection and procure that information without which they could neither maintain themselves nor elude the pursuit of justice, styled themselves royalists and asserted that they were sent by the king to organize an army in La Vendée. They threatened the young men who were called out by the conscription, and if they joined the army, their parents' houses should be burnt and themselves shot if they were taken. The sudden appearance of this little band was like the sound of a tocsin in the different departments. The event was proclaimed on all sides, but at the same time, everyone felt satisfied about the tranquility of the country, which the inhabitants of the departments were determined to maintain. The war minister cried toll from the housetops, declaring that if precautions were not taken, the Bourbons would come to Paris while the emperor was making the next campaign. He made no scruple of announcing as information which he pretended he had received from a general holding a command in the western departments that a gentleman with a white cockade had been going about that part of the country on horseback, endeavoring to enlist followers. Every person of common sense saw the absurdity of this report of a man recruiting with a white cockade at a time when anybody might have ventured to wear one would have been torn to pieces. The emperor, though he did not place much reliance on this information, nevertheless did not despise it. He directed me to investigate the truth. I learned that this gentleman with the white cockade was a farmer residing on the road from Alençon to Le Mans. He was an old officer of the Revolution, and he had been a purchaser of the national domains. The emperor shrugged up his shoulders when he saw the credulity with which reports were circulated, which tended only to induce him to adopt measures of severity towards peaceable citizens who dreaded, instead of wishing, the return of civil dissension. The accusation of the war minister might have had the effect of causing the arrest of almost all the ancient nobility of the Maine, Anjou, and perish. If that measure was not adopted, it was because whenever the emperor received accurate information, his judgment was always correct, and he was naturally inclined to indulgence. What then was the object of the Duc de Feltre, if he himself was not the dupe of the mistaken zeal of his informant? Doubtless to make a show of his own zeal by proving that, in spite of his excessive occupation, he bestowed attention on everything that personally interested the emperor, and that but for his prodigious vigilance, the safety of the empire would never be for a moment certain. While the war minister was thus getting up stories to answer his own ends, I was engaged in the pursuit of the band of plunderers who had already committed several murders in the department of La Sarthe. Some of them were taken, and pardon was offered to the rest on condition of their quitting the department. They consented and surrendered themselves to the prefect of Le Mans. They were then conveyed to the department of the Yonne and dispersed through the communes, where they applied themselves industriously to agricultural labors. This little pacification proved that I was right in my conjecture, and that these pretended royalists were nothing but deserters flagged from the pursuit of the gendarmerie, against whom they defended themselves with musket shot. The gendarmerie in the western departments was excellent. It was commanded by Colonel Henry, a man of singular courage and rectitude, capable of managing satisfactorily any honorable business in which he might be employed. We were indebted to him for many services which his conciliatory character enabled him to perform. The emperor, before his departure for the army, learned the evacuation of Hamburg by General Caras St-Cyr, the same who was unfortunate at Wagram. This event vexed the emperor exceedingly because it was followed followed by an eruption of the enemy's light troops, who advanced as far as the Weser and the Esler and passed those two rivers at several points. He sent Marshal Davout to command the troops who were to retake Hamburg, and called the army to General Lauriston, whom he had previously sent to Hamburg and afterwards to Magdeburg. The Russian and Prussian grand armies had passed the Elbe at Dresden and were advancing to Leipzig. Chapter 10. Austria had not declared herself against us, but she signified that the contingent she had supplied to our army during the last campaign should take no part in the hostilities, so that while she deprived us of resources, the enemy might combine a force as great or even greater against us. The time was short. Insurrections had broken out in Westphalia and Berg, and a crisis was approaching when the emperor set out to head the army. He had given the command of a corps to Marshal Marmont, and he had brought from Laybach in Illyria General Bertrand. With the remainder of the French troops who were in that province, they passed through Bavaria by the way of the Tyrol and were formed into an army corps at Augsburg, whence they marched on Bamberg and the banks of the Saale. Our army had successfully retired into Thuringen. The emperor rejoined it and soon rallied the courage of the troops. He spent some days in combining his different army corps and observing the plans of the enemy. He soon formed an estimate of the generals whom he had to oppose. He was greatly inferior to the enemy in numbers, and the quality of his troops was indifferent, but his genius made amends for these disadvantages, and his success was not doubtful. He found his army in the following position. The viceroy, who commanded the wreck of the army of the preceding campaign, had recrossed the Elbe at Magdeburg and had stationed himself at Meersburg. He had sustained a very considerable loss at Halle, where he recrossed to the left bank of the Saale. He had with him Marshals MacDonald and Victor. The troops who came from France arrived by the way of Weimar and crossed the Saale by the bridge of Käse near Naumburg. Those who came from Italy arrived by the valley of the Main, Kronach, Schleist, Nauma, and Gertz. The emperor had only 10 squadrons of cavalry, and the enemy had upwards of 100. But on the other hand, our artillery was formidable. The emperor put his troops in motion as soon as he learned that the enemy was advancing to meet him. He proceeded in the direction of Leipzig, making the viceroy march from Meersburg to Merkranstadt, while he himself took the high road from Weissenfels to Leipzig to Lutzen. It must be observed that the object of the emperor's maneuver was to approach the fortresses of the Elbe, where he had bridges and garrisons. These were Torgau, Wittenberg, and Magdeburg. On the 2nd of May, the whole army was in motion between Weissenfels and Leipzig. Its van had already proceeded beyond Lutzen when it was attacked at Kaya on the road between Lutzen and Pegau, by which the Russian and Prussian armies, which were marching to intercept our line of communication, passed when they attacked Marshal Ney, who was posted at Kaya. The emperor immediately formed his army in the order of battle in the following manner. The viceroy, who was on the left, supporting Markranstadt, and with him General MacDonald. On the right of the prince was General Lauriston, who commanded an army corps. Farther to the right was Marshal Marmont, and then General Bertrand. Marshal Mortier was in reserve with the infantry of the Young Guard. Marshal Oudinot had not yet arrived with the troops which he was bringing from France, and finally Marshal Ney was at Kaya. The army had the road from Weissenfels to Leipzig in its rear, and the field of battle was intersected diagonally by a stream called the Flossgraben. The key of the position was the village of Kaya, which was occupied by Marshal Ney, and through which ran the road from Pegau to Lutzen. Had the enemy succeeded in carrying this place, he would have advanced to Lutzen and thus divided the French army into two portions, which could only have been reunited on the other bank of the Saale. Thus great efforts were made to preserve Kaya, which was taken and retaken several times in the course of the day. The engagement commenced at 11 in the morning of the 2nd of May, 1813. At 4 in the evening, Kaya was forced. The emperor proceeded thither himself. Amidst a shower of musket shot, the troops were not routed, but they had to contend with a very strong force. He rallied them and stationed himself on the right of Marshal Ney's corps, whence he discerned the columns of the enemy's infantry with which the ground was thickly covered. They were marching from Pegau on the road leading to Kaya, which the enemy had already occupied and by which he was preparing to debouch upon Lutzen. On this movement depended the winning or losing the battle. The emperor ordered his aide-de-camp, the general of artillery Drouot, to collect with all speed 60 pieces of reserve cannon, to take the command of them, and to advance as closely as possible on the enemy's columns, and to attack him obliquely on his left flank. This order was executed literally, and it made such ravages on the enemy's columns in the space of an hour that he could not resist the vigorous attack which the emperor renewed on Kaya by Marshal Mortier's corps, which he had advanced from the reserve. The village was carried, and this decided the retreat of the Russian and Prussian armies, who recrossed the Isler at Pegau and Zwickau. If the emperor had had 20,000 cavalry with which he could have made a vigorous charge after the cannonade, there is no doubt but he would have gained such a victory as would have decided the whole of the campaign. But the want of this cavalry obliged him to pursue the enemy in close column. He was too weak to detach any corps from his army, or he could have marched straight to Berlin. He was therefore obliged to arrange his plans according to what the enemy might do in case of his having as much infantry and artillery as we had, in addition to his immense force of cavalry. At the Battle of Lutzen, or rather the day before, the emperor sustained a severe loss in the death of Marshal Bessières, who fell by a cannonball at Pozarna between Weissenfels and Lutzen. The death of this old and faithful servant produced a void in the emperor's heart. Fate deprived him of his friends, as if to prepare him for the severe reverses which he had yet in store for him. On the evening of the Battle of Lutzen, the army remained in close column through fear of the enemy's cavalry, which attempted several charges during the night. But the reception they had experienced compelled them at length to relinquish these attacks. The night was so exceedingly dark that nothing could be seen at a distance of 10 paces, and there were so few cavalry troops in our army that the squares of infantry were ordered to fire on every horseman who might appear in sight, for it was looked upon as certain that they must belong to the enemy. After the Battle of Lutzen, the emperor again sent his aide-de-camp, General Flahaut, to inform the King of Saxony of the event. With that sovereign evacuated Dresden, he retired to Prague. And at the entreaties of the court of Austria, he had resolved to retire into Austria, perhaps even to go to Vienna. Before the opening of the campaign, the emperor sent one of his aides-de-camp to inform the king of what he intended to do, and to prevail on him to remain in Bohemia, there to await the issue of events. This aide-de-camp joined the king at Linz in Austria, and from what he said, his majesty was induced to return to Prague, where Monsieur de Flahaut found him. The Battle of Lutzen proved an incalculable advantage to us. It secured us against new defections in Germany, and thereby restored that confidence in the future which we had previously lost. Te Deum was sung everywhere. The empress ordered it to be sung at Notre Dame, whither she herself repaired in state. She was attended by the whole court and the troops of the guard, and the public received her with expressions of the most ardent enthusiasm. When she entered Notre Dame, the plaudits of the multitude almost rent the roof of that majestic structure. The French soon recovered from any great depression. Before the Battle of Lutzen, we had all thought ourselves ruined, and immediately after we expected peace. At least we hoped that it would, at all events, speedily follow so glorious an event. This inspired courage, and all concurred in admiring the talent with which the emperor had extricated himself from his imminent peril, so that the attachment of which he had so long been the object lost none of its force or sincerity. It may here be observed that had the Austrians, instead of their tergiversation, supplied the continent, contingent, which they owed us in fulfillment of our treaties with them, which they scrupulously observed during our prosperity. Peace would have been concluded immediately after the Battle of Lutzen, for the Allies would not have incurred the chances of a new campaign, or if they had, the Austrian cavalry would have enabled us to profit by the victory, but the Allies would not have incurred such a risk. If they had not known the intentions of Austria, they would not have crossed the Elbe, and perhaps they would have remained on the other side of the Vistula. Russia now reaped the fruit of the conduct of which she set the example in 1809 in taking no part in the campaign. This is called policy, but any monarch of the 15th century would have blushed to have acted so, and it remained for the 18th century to witness repeated instances of such conduct. Among the other improvements of this enlightened age, it would have been more honorable on the part of Austria to have refused to march into Russia. She knew whither she was led and why she was taken there, and certainly if she had refused to cooperate in the enterprise, she would not have been forced to it. Her refusal would have been honorable, and it would perhaps have occasioned the relinquishment of the enterprise. After the Battle of Lutzen, the Emperor marched his army on Dresden, whither the combined Russian and Prussian forces were retiring. When their retrograde movement was no longer doubtful, it was evident they would not come to an engagement. Before the Elbe, the Emperor began a maneuver so as to approach that river at several points. Marshal Ney crossed it at Wittenberg, after which he established his right within the distance of a day's march in front of Torgau. He was replaced before Wittenberg by Marshal Victor. General Lauriston crossed the Elbe at Torgau, where there was a Saxon garrison commanded by General Thielmann, who was also a native of Saxony, imbued with the new doctrines which pervaded Germany. This officer refused to surrender the fortress to the Allies, but he enrolled himself under their banners as soon as he heard that the King of Saxony had given it up to the French. The Emperor, the remainder of the army, marched upon Dresden, where he arrived on the 9th or 10th of May. He was rejoined by Marshal Soult, whom he had recalled from Spain after the junction of the Andalusian army with the troops commanded by King Joseph. The French, incoming from Russia, had cut the bridge of Dresden in their retreat from Warsaw. On the Elbe, the enemy restored it in order to cross the Elbe, and subsequently broke it on his retreat. The Emperor, in his turn, repaired it for the passage of his army. He remained at Dresden about 10 days in order to observe the enemy, as well as to maneuver and wait for the troops who were marching to join him. The King of Saxony returned from Prague and entered his capital on the 12th or 13th of June. This sovereign remained faithful to us in our adversity, as well as in our good fortune. The Emperor directed the army towards the frontiers of Silesia. The left, consisting of the corps of Marshal Ney and General Lauriston, took the way of Tobruk and Hoverswede, while the troops who had proceeded to Dresden marched on Bischofswerda. This latter portion of the army consisted of the corps of Marshal Oudinot, who had rejoined the army, Marshals Marmont, MacDonald, and General Bertrand, the foot and horse guards, some Saxon troops, and the cavalry which had come from Spain and France. The viceroy had been sent from Dresden, Italy, where it had become necessary to adopt precautions against the unfavorable symptoms manifested by Austria. Chapter 11. The enemy's army had taken the road to Silesia and had posted itself at Bautzen, which it occupied, as well as a second position behind, which was stronger than the first. The Emperor ordered the enemy's position to be reconnoitered. The officers of the engineers pronounced it to be assailable and observed that it was the same which Frederick the Great had once occupied. That may be, said the Emperor, but Frederick is not there now. The army commenced its motion to the left. The action commenced, and the enemy, who was outflanked on the right and broken in the center, was obliged to leave us masters of the field of battle. This affair, which took place on the 20th and 21st of May, was preceded by a reconnaissance, which occasioned rather a serious engagement between Generals Bertrand and Lauriston and the enemy's corps commanded by Generals Kleist and Barclay de Tolly, who had come to reconnoitre. army. The Battle of Bautzen was a very gallant affair, for the French had only their masses of infantry to oppose to the enemy's cannon and musketry. However, the enemy retired, leaving us masters of the field of battle, but nothing else, so that affairs were no farther advanced than before. The Russian and Prussian army retired upon Schweidnitz by the way of Gorlitz, Bunzlau, Hanau, and Liegnitz. This singular march towards the frontiers of Bohemia was evident proof that they had an understanding with the Austrians. Otherwise, they would have exposed themselves to utter destruction, because by abandoning Breslau to us, they afforded us an opportunity of arriving on the Oder before them, if they intended to cross the river by the bridge of Breslau. If their design was to cross it elsewhere, we might also arrive before them at any point. They might make a choice of whether they wished to defend Prussia, from which they were thus separated, and where they had left only Marshal Bulow's corps to cover Berlin, or whether they wished to cover Poland. We had in the fortress of Glogau on the Oder a garrison that still held out, so that our left, that is to say Marshal Victor, might, as I have already said, reach the river before the enemy. It was therefore easy to foresee what would happen from the position taken by the Russian and Prussian armies, which had placed themselves at the mercy of Austria and had abandoned Prussia to any attempt that might be made against her. The emperor was fully aware of the situation of Europe and the crisis that was approaching. He had proposed the opening of a congress in which the interests and claims of each power might be discussed and estimated. No answer had been returned to his proposal, but our late victory had somewhat damped the dreams of ambition. After the defeat, the Allies acceded to the propositions which they had previously rejected. The emperor hoped that a truce might bring about an adjustment, and he consented to an armistice. He was deeply affected by the loss of the Grand Marshal, who was killed on the day after the Battle of Bautzen. Duroc had just upped the emperor to give an order relative to the service of his department, and he was conversing with General Kirchner when both were struck by a spent ball. Kirchner fell dead on the spot, and the ball tore open the abdomen of the Grand Marshal, who survived for the space of 30 hours. He refused all surgical assistance, declaring that it could be of no avail and would tend only to increase his sufferings. He entreated that something might be given to him to hasten his death, and indeed it would have been an act of humanity to have done so, but no one would render him this sad service. The emperor went to see him and to bid him adieu. Duroc conversed with him, apparently unmindful of his situation. He spoke of France and recommended his daughter to the emperor. He evinced no regret at his approaching dissolution, and several times repeated that he had nothing to fear from the judgment of either God or man. He added that the accounts of his department would be found to be in the best order. The emperor had stayed with Duroc a considerable time, and at length the marshal begged he would withdraw. Observing that the scene was too painful for his feelings, he breathed his last a few hours afterwards. Fate thus deprived the emperor of a man whose zeal, spirit of order, and strict integrity were at that time most necessary to him. The emperor deeply lamented Duroc, as he also did Bessir. The death of Duroc was an irreparable loss. The emperor frequently rendered homage to the memory of that officer. Duroc, Duroc, he used to exclaim whenever anything was not done as he wished. Duroc was originally a pupil of the military school of Paris. On the suppression of that establishment, he went to the school of Mont-à-Mousson, and he soon after entered the artillery service. He commanded the artillery of the fortress of Monaco when the emperor was appointed commander-in-chief of the army of Italy. The general happened to see the young officer and appreciated his talent. He made him his aide-de-camp, and they never afterwards separated. Duroc was a remarkably intelligent man. His shrewd and analytical mind enabled him to seize a subject with singular sagacity. However confused a report might be drawn up, he readily extracted from it all that was essential. Such was his spirit of order, that having occasion to transmit instructions from the army for various things that were to be done in Paris, he pointed out the papers in his office which contained the information requisite for the execution of his orders. It was Duroc who established that admirable regularity which prevailed in the imperial palaces, the repairs and furnishing of which he superintended. The household expenses of the court were regulated with as strict a regard to economy as the outlay of any department directly under public control, and yet luxury and splendor were conspicuous in offering to suspend the movement of his troops. The emperor hoped to bring himself into direct communication with the Russians and thus avoid the intervention of a power whose plans had not escaped his observation. He wished for peace, but for a solid and honorable peace founded on the interests of the different states and not on the convenience of his enemies. Thus, in his instructions as well in his correspondence, he unceasingly recommended his plenipotentiary to think of the means of bringing about some direct overture. Austria, he conceived, was already in the coalition, and he preferred addressing himself to the chief rather than communicating through the medium of one of the members of the League, which was armed against him. But all was already agreed upon among the sovereigns. They had submitted the question of peace to the cabinet of Vienna, and that was the power to be addressed. Napoleon yielded and accepted the mediation. Austria at length gained the object which she had been seeking by so many stratagems and artifices. But what was our natural situation? Did the Treaty of Paris still subsist? Was the alliance broken up? This remained to be decided. The Duc de Bassano demanded explanations on these points. Count Metternich eagerly sought to convince him that there was no inconsistency between these two acts, and that the only object was to make some reserves. Being pressed to explain himself on the nature of these reserves, he modestly declared that they were to extend to all the stipulations which might affect the impartiality of the mediator. This was an abuse of words, for to place all the stipulations in the reserves was to annul the treaty. The emperor, offended at these low artifices, offered to break off a connection which appeared to be a source of annoyance to Austria. Metternich refused, but in referring to the mode of discussion to be adopted at the Congress, he openly declared that France was to appear there only through the medium of the cabinet of Vienna. The emperor repelled this suggestion and presented to Count Metternich such a plan, the object of which was to reestablish Europe on the basis on which she stood before she suffered the ravages of 30 Years' War, and to subsist a general for a partial peace negotiated not in the cabinet but openly in the face of Europe. He invited all nations and all parties to debate their respective interests as they were used to do at Munster, Nijmegen, Ryswyk, Utrecht, etc. Metternich had no plausible objection to oppose to this. He canceled all that was most liberal in the plan, signed the rest, and withdrew. The Emperor of Austria had established himself in Prague under the pretense of being nearer for the communications which he had to make to both parties as mediator. The King of Prussia and the Emperor of Russia had fixed their quarters at Schweidnitz, and they could consequently communicate with Prague as often as they pleased. The events of this period will hold so important a place in history that it is impossible to enter too minutely into details and observations to enable the reader to judge how a successive accumulation of misfortunes at length overthrew the finest structure of glory that was ever raised by the power of genius. An armistice was concluded. This measure proved that the emperor did not refuse to make peace, since he had it in his power to refuse a suspension of arms which deprived him of the advantages he had gained over the enemy since the commencement of hostilities. There could be no doubt, it was said, that the Russians wished for peace, and yet it was not concluded. Let us see why. The Austrians had been our allies since the campaign of 1812. If that had been successful, it would no doubt have been followed by some arrangements prejudicial to Russia and favorable to Prussia and Austria. In the situation in which affairs then were, there could be no thought of such a design. Peace could only be concluded on other basis. Consequently, the emperor never proposed to renew the projects of the preceding campaign. The events of Lutzen and Bautzen had not advanced his interests sufficiently for that, but it was believed that the sacrifices ought not to be demanded from the Russian and Prussians. It at least appeared unjust to think of requiring the emperor to make on his part such great sacrifices for the satisfaction of all parties. Nevertheless, this was proposed, and by whom? By allies who had not only abandoned and acknowledged by treaty secession of provinces which they now reclaimed, but who had marched under his banners to aid him in acquiring new possessions on no other condition than that some portion should revert to them. If the Austrians had no other object in view than to secure peace, It would have been sufficient for them, even though they had not remained our allies, to have refrained from taking part in the war, since they believed they might honorably forsake us in the circumstances in which we were placed. Had the Austrians remained neutral, Russia and Prussia would have been obliged to conclude peace. Their resources were already exhausted, and they had been compelled to retreat from the very opening of the campaign. They would have treated on the Oder for more reasonable conditions than those which would have been imposed upon them on the Vistula or the Niemen. If, therefore, they did not treat during this armistice, it was, as I have already observed, because they were secure of Austria. And why did they seek the support of Austria? It was not for obtaining conditions which they well knew could not be withheld from them, nor for rejecting others which could not be proposed, but because the Emperor of Russia would not again expose himself to the danger he had escaped at Tilsit and in the campaign of the preceding winter. The best proof that it was not in the power of Russia and Prussia to refuse to treat is that they both appealed to Austria to counterbalance by her influence the preponderance which the emperor had already resumed over them. This preponderance was continually spoken of, while France was not allowed to object to the acquisitions which these same powers had made while she was engaged in her revolution. The Emperor of Russia acted wisely for his own interests in bringing Austria to a declaration, because if fortune had not favored him, he might have marched back to his own states with his army, well persuaded that the French would not be inclined to follow him a second time, but would in preference take the road to Vienna, which the same circumstance opened to them. The Emperor Alexander would thus have left his allies to settle the business, while he got out of the difficulty himself. If, on the contrary, fortune had proved favorable to him, he might, in the negotiations, have added his claims to those of his allies, who could not then have been satisfied, but at the expense of France. That is to say, France would have been ruined, which was all Russia wanted, as she would then have nothing to fear, and by remaining the strongest of the European powers at the close of the war, she would naturally be the arbiter of the destinies of the world. This was certainly monstrous conduct on the part of the governments of Europe, whose state maxims seemed to be submission to the prosperous and bad faith to the unfortunate. Such sentiments ought to have been banished from thrones, but amidst the disasters of that period, not even monarchs were proof against corruption. We were obliged to accommodate ourselves to circumstances without seeking from justice that which we could not obtain from force. Chapter 12. After the Battle of Lutzen, the Emperor Napoleon wrote to the Emperor of Austria proposing that the Allies should assemble a Congress at Prague. The Congress met. Russia sent as her negotiator an Alsatian, whom our laws did not permit us to acknowledge as the agent of a foreign power. Prussia sent Monsieur de Chardenberg, who attached himself to the Russian envoy. Austria sent Monsieur de Metternich, and England dispatched Lord Aberdeen to assist as her minister plenipotentiary at the conference, but his lordship did not arrive until after the rupture of the armistice. This circumstance appeared to have been foreseen by the English government, for Lord Aberdeen was also a mission as envoy to the Emperor of Austria, which character he assumed. Napoleon had accepted the mediation from the moment when he proposed to negotiate for a peace after the Battle of Lutzen. It was now a month since the Emperor had demanded the opening of a Congress. On the 15th of June, he urged the settlement of the convention, which was to arrange the offer and the acceptance of the mediation, and he declared himself ready to sign it. He had at the same time intimated, with the view of obviating all difficulty, that he could only negotiate according to the forms consecrated by custom and by plenipotentiaries, who, on meeting those of the other sovereigns, would exchange their full powers and enter upon explanations. This was a clear and precise definition of a negotiation by conferences. Monsieur de Metternich acceded explicitly enough to these conditions on a note dated the 22nd, which he himself transmitted to Dresden on the 26th. In this note, the question was again discussed as being essentially connected with that of the mediation. There was perfect concurrence on both sides. The words, the French, Russian, and Prussian plenipotentiaries shall meet, were chosen by common consent in order to establish a negotiation by conferences and remove all ideas of an arbitration in which each party would have separately pleaded his cause before the plenipotentiary of the mediator, an arbitration against which the emperor distinctly and decidedly protested, and which Mr. de Metternich denied that the court of Vienna had ever wished for. The forms thus stipulated were prescribed to the French plenipotentiaries in their instructions. The Count de Narbonne had been for a considerable time at Prague, and his powers were forwarded to him on the 16th. The delays of the enemy and of Austria on the subject of the prolongation of the armistice occasioned the departure of the Duke de Vicenza, to be postponed for some days. The Duke, who no doubt guessed the disposition of the foreign powers, and who foresaw the results, instead of hurrying his departure, retarded it by applications for money and other economical arrangements. At length he set out on the 27th. The emperor, who had secretly received some hints relative to the engagements contracted by Trauschenberg, by Austria, with the Allies, set out at 4 a.m. on the 25th for Metz, in order to determine the measures to be taken in France in the event which, though not certain, was at least probable, in the continuance of the war, and to secure himself even against Austria, as he himself said in his letter of the 29th of July to the Duke of Vicenza. The general aspect of affairs produced an obvious impression on his mind. On the arrival of the Duke de Vicenza, Mr. de Metternich knew that the emperor was absent. He alone could authorize modifications in the forms agreed upon for the negotiations. He arranged his plans accordingly when he found that he had no longer any hope of preventing the opening of the Congress, and when the French plenipotentiaries demanded a general exchange of powers, he rejected the form that had been settled for the conferences and proposed transactions by writing, quoting very inapplicably the example of the Congress of Teschen, which was a solitary exception from the general custom. At that Congress, there were 2 mediators instead of 1, who negotiated together, each representing the interests of the party who had chosen him, and there was not, as at Prague, a general negotiation of the great interests of the public law of Europe, but merely of the Bavarian succession. Mr. de Metternich, 12 days before the declaration of the armistice, thus checked the negotiation in the outset by a difficulty which obliged the French plenipotentiaries to wait for the commands of the emperor, who was in France. The Austrian manifesto, written by Monsieur von Gentz, contains a sort of avowal of the artifice of the cabinet of Vienna, the form in which the full powers were to be exhibited, and the reciprocal declarations open matters on which there had already been conferences on all sides, became the subject of a discussion which baffled all the efforts of the mediating minister. The conduct which Austria pursued at Prague perfectly corresponded with the course she had adopted since the commencement of the negotiations. She began by mingling her own private claims with those of the other allies, wishing to constitute herself the arbiter of the disputes which divided them. Thus the question at issue was no longer the termination of the first war, but the commencement of a new one, and all that had been settled in the treaties which followed, that of Luneville, again came under consideration. Austria styled herself a mediator, that is to say, being placed between the 2 parties. She did not concern herself about the interests of either, but thought only of her own, reserving to herself the privilege of taking part with the power who might offer her facilities for recovering cheaply the object of her ambition, now as all she had lost in her wars with France was either in our hands or in those of our allies. It cost the Emperor of Russia nothing to promise that her losses should be made good, because at all events he was not obliged to fulfill his promise had military events proved unfortunate, as they well nigh did. Austria knew that she had no right to expect what she demanded, except from the weakness to which her conduct had reduced us. This was her security on the one hand, and on the other, she knew that Russia and Prussia could only conclude a disadvantageous peace without her concurrence. She had this superiority, that she knew her situation and turned it to the best account, because in making war for war's sake, it was reasonable to adopt the course by which there was most to be gained. All this should have been understood before we went to Prague to oppose arguments and refute propositions, which, though unreasonable and dictated by bad faith, were nevertheless those of the stronger party. We should either not have gone there, or if we did, we should have made up in talent what we wanted in the illusion of power to enable us to triumph over the artifice of Monsieur de Metternich. But we were in a difficult situation. We were to be crushed without mercy, though the emperor, far from taking an undue advantage of any of his victories, had always refrained from oppressing the vanquished. He constantly checked himself in his triumphs, being reluctant, as he used to say, to reduce a nation to despair. In Italy, he made the first step towards reconciling the French Revolution with Europe, and he laid the basis of a peace which was signed at Campo Formio after the battles of Marengo and Hohenlinden. He stopped when it was in his power to have marched to Vienna. After the Battle of Austerlitz, he stopped short when it was in his power to have confounded the most shameful aggressions. And at Tilsit, after the Battle of Friedland, he renounced all the advantages of a war still more fortunate than the first, and did not follow up his successes against a power whose forces were exhausted, because he wished to facilitate peace and to secure the tranquility of Europe on a steady foundation. Such examples of magnanimity deserve to be remembered. There was another consideration which ought not to have been lost sight of by the sovereign. Napoleon had calmed the revolutionary ferment and had given laws to the democracy by which they had so long been menaced. He was reproached for his insatiable thirst of glory and love of war, but he had given a pledge of his wish to live in peace by contracting an alliance with the house which had reason to cherish the strongest resentment against him, and which he would have had little difficulty in ruining. Another circumstance should also have been taken into account, which was that Metternich stood in a peculiar situation. He was reproached by the Emperor of Austria for having advised the War of 1809, which France also attributed to him. He was besides unpopular among the countrymen who had suffered by the calamities resulting from the war, and he could not but be conscious that sooner or later he would experience the resentment of France if ever she should resume her influence at Vienna. His late conduct, as well as what he had done in 1809, had operated so much to the prejudice of France that she could not easily forget it. Metternich recovered the good graces of his sovereign by warmly conducting the negotiation, which was commenced without his instigation, for concluding the marriage between the Archduchess and the Emperor. Thus he caused it to be believed in France that he controlled everything at Vienna, while at Vienna he induced a supposition that he was on good terms with France. By this means he settled his account with France, but this had no effect on public opinion in Austria, where it was well known that he had not suggested the marriage. He, however, gained the favor of his countrymen by seizing the opportunity of recovering for Austria all that she had lost during the last 20 years. He was not obliged to account for the means he employed to gain this object. The result is only to be judged of, and that was most successful. Chapter 13. The emperor's enemies have thought proper to report that it was in his power to have concluded peace by abandoning Danzig and Hanover. This is a false assertion. The Allies demanded the restoration of nearly all they had lost, some by the Treaty of Tilsit and others by the Treaty of Vienna, independently of what they had not recognized, for example, the Union of Holland, the Hanse Towns, etc. None of them mentioned the compensation they had received, for all of which they had been deprived was not lost, since they had received indemnities by the same treaties in which these cessions were stipulated. The fact is that they had been consequently obliged to surrender the indemnities in consequence of the misfortunes to which the new aggressions exposed them. But since the object was to restore the equilibrium of Europe, this is not the way to gain it, for some would have acquired not only that they previously possessed, but also that which they had not possessed before the general revolution, of which they were the instigators. I have entered into these details only to prove that the emperor could not have made peace so easily as his enemies have thought proper to allege, and that he was forced to continue the war because he could not obtain a complete and lasting peace. He would have thought no sacrifice too great for the attainment of this object. He consigned the management of the negotiations to his minister and devoted his principal attention to the reinforcement of his army, because he plainly saw that his enemies had in view to undermine his power by war. He fortified Dresden, which he had made his capital, and round which he intended to maneuver if a renewal of hostilities should follow the armistice. He put every place under contribution from whence he could procure a man or a horse. He fortified Hamburg and withdrew almost all the troops he had there to bring them to Dresden. They were replaced at Hamburg by Danish troops, Denmark having returned to our alliance since the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen. The emperor caused all the Confederate princes who were yet attached to him to exert the greatest efforts, and in short he neglected nothing for the augmentation of his physical power in order that it might in some measure react on his moral power. He recalled the King of Naples to the army. That prince thought the emperor ruined beyond redemption, but the victories of Lutzen and Bautzen brought him back to his duty. After the Russian campaign, he abandoned the army, the command of which the emperor had entrusted to him, and he hurried to Naples to attend to his own affairs. He was simple enough to believe that he could remain king independently of the emperor's support. The result proved, as will by and by be seen, that even at the time of this journey to Naples, he was in correspondence with the enemy. The Queen of Naples was declared regent of the kingdom. Previous to the departure of the king for the Russian campaign, she loved dominion, and she wanted the emperor's authority for assuming at Naples the title which was the object of her ambition. She made good use of her power, and she had the rare talent of employing it in a way to render herself beloved. She had a firm hand, but a generous heart, and while she held the reins of government, she scattered benefits around her with an unsparing hand. She esteemed and respected her husband, but she wished to enjoy undivided power. She did not therefore oppose the return of the king to the army, as it was a means of restoring her to authority. The king of Naples rejoined the emperor at Dresden during the armistice, and he resumed the command of what little cavalry we still possessed there. The emperor had likewise called the Duke of Otranto, M. Fouché, from Paris to Dresden, and hence it was inferred that he intended to employ him in the negotiations. I knew the contrary. The emperor only called M. Fouché to Dresden to spare himself the disagreeable task of again interfering with him, for it was understood that he had begun to intrigue in Paris, and he would infallibly have caused some acts of folly just for the sake of having it said that, while he was in office, such and such things would not have happened. Monsieur Fouché was of a restless disposition. He always wanted to be employed on something, and generally against somebody. He had already contrived to get access to the Empress, whose favor he was eagerly endeavoring to gain in order to turn it to his own purposes when occasion should serve. For my own part, I was not sorry for this removal, as it relieved me from the annoyance of receiving the condolence of persons who thought it impossible that the Duke of Otranto should not return to a post for which they considered him exclusively competent if the emperor had not called him to Dresden. It is probable that he and I would not long have continued on a footing of good understanding, for I was resolved to take my revenge whenever he might attempt any intrigue, the object of which could only be to cast ridicule on me. We should then have seen which of the two would have outstripped the other. I was far from concurring with those who attributed to him a vast share of talent. It will be seen whether experience has justified my opinion. The government of the Empress Regent was mild and well calculated for the unfortunate circumstances in which we were placed. She presided at the Council of Ministers, guided by the Arch-Chancellor. That prince himself waited upon her to inform her when the council was assembled, and he followed her to the chamber in which it was held. The emperor ordered that the department of the Grand Judge, whence she received reports of the proceedings of the tribunals, should not lay before her the cases of unpardonable offenders, because she did not wish to sign her name to any judgment except for the purpose of pardoning. She granted many pardons, and she did so without ostentation. No pains were taken to trumpet forth her praise, but her merits were known and appreciated by all who surrounded her. She was simple and natural, and made no efforts to gain admiration. She received all who sought to approach her, but she never tried to attract those who were not drawn to her by sentiments of esteem. She would, no doubt, in the course of time, have had enemies like all sovereigns, but hitherto she was the object of profound respect and general admiration. I feel pleasure in repeating that on no occasion did I find it necessary to resort to any underhand means of securing to the Empress a good reception from the public, by whom she was sincerely esteemed and beloved. All went on very well in France. The misfortunes we had already suffered were not adverted to because a happy result was expected from the conferences at Prague, which had become a subject of general solicitude. Hopes of a speedy peace were confidently entertained because the armistice, which was to expire on the 8th of July, was prolonged until the 17th of August. There was every reason to conclude that this time would be well employed and sufficient for settling and terminating discussions respecting which it was so necessary to come to a good understanding. At this conjuncture, a disaster occurred in Spain, which was calculated to damp the hopes entertained in France and to embarrass the negotiations at Prague, inasmuch as the enemy might take advantage of our altered situation in Spain. Chapter 14. After the junction of the armies of Marshal Soult and Suchet, the English army returned to its position beyond Salamanca. After the departure of Marshal Soult for Paris, his army remained under the command of the King of Spain. We fell into the same error as in the preceding year. We did not pay sufficient attention to the English army, before which we ought either to have held a position or have avoided engaging. But an evil genius presided over our arms in Spain. The generals set out, each to his viceroyalty, caring but little for what might happen. Marshal Suchet returned to Catalonia. The war minister, the Duke de Feltre, to whom the emperor, on his departure, left the direction of the operations in Biscay and Navarre, had employed the army, which was formerly under Marshal Marmont, to scour the two provinces in movable columns and to pursue the guerrillas, who certainly did not deserve so much attention as the English army, so that only the troops which had come from Andalusia remained combined in the army corps. The king was, I believe, at Valladolid or even Madrid when the English army began to advance. To afford an idea of the manner in which the emperor was served, it is sufficient to observe that the order was transmitted from Paris, directing General Clausel, who commanded the army which had been under Marmont, to form a junction with the king's army. The general's troops were in movable columns in Navarre when this order was received. The time lost for the march of the troops may be guessed from the interval that was occupied, first in sending from the threatened point information of the approach of the English, second in transmitting this intelligence to Paris and demanding the employment of the troops who were in Navarre, and finally in conveying to the latter the order for marching. There was, moreover, a very strong line of echelons for maintaining communication between Bayonne and the king's quarters. There was Vittoria, an immense quantity of artillery which had been accumulated there. After the successive evacuations which we had been forced to make, this artillery was to have been sent to Bayonne, or at least to some other Spanish fortress, but for want of horses, or from some other cause, it had been left at Vittoria. The situation of our army was nearly such as I have just described. While all this time was lost in the French army, the English had commenced a grand movement, which they executed as tranquilly as if they had no enemy before them. The English general had no doubt calculated every circumstance that was likely to forward his plans, and when once he had got the start of his movements, he kept up his advantages until the moment when fortune crowned his efforts in the plains of Vittoria. The surrender of Astorga and the evacuation of the whole of the kingdom of Leon gave him the opportunity of maneuvering with all his army. After rallying the Spanish division which came from Galicia, he was enabled to conduct his troops by the back of the mountains and to get into the road to France so as to threaten the communication between Bayonne and our army by debouching on Biviesca, Miranda, or Vittoria, as might be most advantageous to him. This movement, which he would not have ventured upon before an active and maneuvering enemy, was executed without the firing of a single gun, like a quiet march in a time of peace. When the French army was aware of the advance of the enemy, it was too late to rally all the troops which might have been collected to oppose the English general, who, depending on no person, had it in his power to act as he pleased in any enterprise. The French army retreated successfully from Douro on Burgos, the Ebro, and finally in Vittoria. because the English army, which was greatly superior, outflanked our right, on which it had gained an advance. In this way, the army approached Vittoria, where it was intended to wait for the junction of the troops, which were expected to reinforce King Joseph's army. But the English army arrived before us, debouched on the right of our army, which engaged with Vittoria in the rear of its right, and its front facing the west. The result was not long doubtful. Troops thus led in retreat from Cadiz to the frontiers of France could see as clearly as their generals that all the efforts they might make would be insufficient to withstand the English army, since its force was so decidedly superior. While the whole of the line was in action, a corps of cavalry debouched by the left of the English and advanced on the road between Vittoria and Bayonne. This movement threw the French army into disorder because the English cavalry pushed onto the park of artillery and the carriages and wagons of all the refugees in the rear of the army. Everyone thought then of saving the baggage, and the army was instantly in a state of complete rout. Thus troops, which a few years before were superior to the legions of ancient Rome, lost by license and the little attention paid to them, that discipline and that high spirit without which the most warlike nations could never attain the superiority which they acquire over others.